The woke mind virus isn't about justice. It's about fear dressed as virtue. We've all felt it. That tension in the air where conversations aren't really conversations anymore. They're battles. What started as a call for fairness and compassion has twisted into something darker. Repression, projection, and moral superiority parading as enlightenment. Carl Jung would say the collective shadow is breaking into the open, and the human mind is at war with itself. That's why the West feels so fragmented. Because what we refuse to face within, we attack without. This video isn't about politics. It's about psychoanalysis, philosophy, and the art of living in times of cultural hysteria. We'll break down how woke ideology feeds off repression, how cancel culture masks unconscious conflict, and why individuation is the only antidote to ideological possession. You'll see how shadow projection fuels cultural polarization, how identity politics erases individuality, and why integration, not louder dogma, is the key to real awakening. If you've been feeling suffocated by tribalism, exhausted by cancel culture, or disillusioned with identity politics, you're not alone. Jung offers a way forward, not through louder opinions, but through wisdom, self-awareness, and the courage to confront the shadow. The question is, are you ready to stop projecting and start individuating? What the woke mind virus really represents. People throw around the phrase woke mind virus like it's some mysterious plague infecting society, but let's strip it down to what it really means. At its core, it represents a kind of ideological rigidity, one dressed up as moral enlightenment. And here's the tricky part. It's not that the values of equality, justice, or compassion are wrong. They're noble. The danger creeps in when these ideas stop being a compass for wisdom and instead turn into a stick for punishment. Just like Carl Jung warned, when philosophy is reduced to dogma, it becomes less about truth and more about control. That's the hidden infection, when the art of living becomes the policing of living. Now, think about the human mind as a landscape full of valleys, mountains, and shadows. In psychoanalysis, Jung reminds us that ignoring the shadow side of ourselves creates repression, and repression always leaks out in ugly ways. What begins as a sincere inner dialogue about fairness mutates into external hostility when complexity is silenced. You see it in cultural polarization, when conversations no longer explore but dictate. A person who once sought understanding might suddenly find themselves weaponizing cancel culture, as if every dissenting voice were a personal enemy. It's not dialogue anymore. It's mass hysteria disguised as conscience. If you've ever argued with someone online, you know how quickly a debate shifts from "I disagree with your point" to "you are the enemy." That shift is the mark of projection, where unresolved, unconscious conflict takes the stage. People act as if attacking the other side purifies them of their own flaws. But in reality, it's just shadow projection at a cultural scale. Instead of asking, what part of me is unsettled by this, the reflex becomes, you are dangerous, and I must silence you. It's ego inflation, not individuation. And the more tribalism grows, the more individuals lose their own voice. What makes this even more slippery is how the persona gets reshaped. Identity politics becomes a script. Say the right words, post the right slogans, or risk exile. Many start living by projection instead of wisdom, and moral superiority becomes the badge of belonging. Jung would argue this is a form of psychological splitting. When people can no longer hold complexity, they fragment. They cling to ideology as if it's the self, forgetting that individuation requires wrestling with inner contradictions. The human mind thrives in tension, not in simplistic purity. And here's the paradox. Movements that begin with a call for justice can morph into engines of fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of not belonging. Fear of being cast out by one's own tribe. That's why Jung's philosophy still feels so urgent. It reveals how cultural fragmentation often hides a deeper wound within the collective unconscious. What looks like progress on the surface can secretly be a battle with unresolved shadows beneath. And when those shadows aren't faced individually, they're inevitably projected outward, opening the door to the very dangers Jung warned us about. Carl Jung and the danger of shadow projection. Carl Jung once said that the things we dislike most in others often mirror the parts of ourselves we refuse to face. That insight cuts deep when we look at how society reacts under the grip of woke ideology. What people call cancel culture often looks like moral superiority on the surface, but beneath it lives the darker story of the collective shadow. Instead of confronting unconscious conflict within, people project their denied aggression onto others. Suddenly, dissenters become villains, scapegoats for everything unresolved in the human mind. And in that moment, psychoanalysis shifts from a tool of wisdom into a stage for cultural polarization. Think of it this way. If someone represses anger, they might lash out at strangers online, cloaked in the language of justice. This isn't true conscience at work, it's repression in disguise. Jung warned that shadow projection makes us blind to our own flaws, tricking us into believing we're the enlightened ones while everyone else is dangerous. But projection never heals, it fragments. It pushes people further into tribalism, where identity politics takes center stage and inner dialogue goes silent. The shadow grows louder the more we deny it, until mass hysteria erupts and moral superiority becomes a kind of ideological possession. Take the example of public shaming. A celebrity makes a mistake, and instead of dialogue, the mob rushes to demonize. This isn't about holding someone accountable. It's about finding a vessel for collective aggression. Cancel culture thrives because it offers a socially acceptable outlet for shadow projection. But every scapegoat chosen only hides the fact that the psyche is at war with itself. Jung would remind us that the real danger isn't in the so-called enemy, but in our refusal to integrate our own unconscious conflict. When the shadow is ignored, it always finds a way to return, and usually through destructive means. This dynamic leads to what we might call cultural fragmentation. Whole groups become defined not by wisdom or philosophy, but by who they hate, who they exile, and who they repress. Ego inflation convinces people they are morally superior, while the deeper inner life is neglected. Archetypes, once sources of guidance, turn into rigid masks that distort the self. The persona becomes a shield against vulnerability instead of a bridge to authentic individuation. Jung saw this danger clearly. Once the shadow is projected, the mind begins to fracture, leaving individuals prisoners of collective rage instead of seekers of inner truth. So when dissent is demonized, when projection fuels identity politics, what we're really seeing is not strength but weakness. It's the fear of facing one's own inner dialogue, replaced with the thrill of destroying others. And that's where Jung's warnings sound almost prophetic. A society that refuses to integrate the shadow will eventually become possessed by it. Cultural polarization isn't just political, it's psychological splitting on a mass scale. And unless we face the self, we risk being consumed by archetypal forces far bigger than us, pushing us toward the next stage of collapse. Identity politics and the collapse of the individual. When Carl Jung spoke of individuation, he emphasized the journey of becoming a whole, unique self. But identity politics often pushes people in the opposite direction, erasing nuance in favor of group conformity. Instead of exploring the depths of the human mind, people collapse into collective complexes, repeating slogans as if they were their own thoughts. The persona, that mask we use to navigate society, becomes dictated by ideological possession. It stops reflecting the self and starts mirroring tribal expectations. In this shift, the art of living gets reduced to performing loyalty to a tribe rather than cultivating wisdom. Imagine someone who once had a vibrant inner life, full of curiosity and inner dialogue. Over time, they begin filtering every opinion through the lens of group approval. Is this acceptable? Will I be canceled? Their individuality shrinks, and conscience is replaced by fear. This isn't just repression, it's ego inflation masked as humility. By hiding behind collective identity, people avoid confronting the shadow. Jung saw this clearly. When individuals stop wrestling with their own unconscious conflict, they become empty vessels for cultural polarization. They project instead of reflect, and projection always leads to fragmentation. The tragedy here is that real voices get lost. Instead of expressing the archetypes alive within them, the lover, the warrior, the sage, people flatten themselves into ideological stereotypes. It's like trading Shakespeare for a Twitter bio. Concise, sharp, but stripped of soul. The unconscious longs for depth, but the more tribalism grows, the more identity politics pushes people to betray their inner dialogue. And betrayal of the self is always costly. It kills creativity, strangles philosophy, and leaves people hollow in ways they can't quite name. To bring it down to earth, think of how conversations unfold online. Nuance disappears. A thoughtful question becomes a threat. A disagreement becomes an act of war. This is psychological splitting, where people can't hold two truths at once. So they exile one and glorify the other. But when the mind does that, it doesn't grow, it breaks. Individuation demands complexity. It demands holding opposites together without collapsing into either. By contrast, identity politics thrives on collapse. It thrives on scapegoating, on shadow projection, on the false promise that safety lies in numbers. And so the individual, who could have been on a path of individuation, dissolves into the noise of cultural possession. They become less a seeker of wisdom and more a soldier in someone else's ideological battle. This collapse isn't just a political issue, it's a spiritual one. Jung would say the self cannot emerge through conformity. It requires rebellion, confrontation with the shadow, and the courage to embrace inner dialogue even when it offends the crowd. Without this, the individual fades, and what remains is a culture drunk on mass hysteria, racing toward a divide it doesn't yet understand. Cultural fragmentation and the archetype of the divide. Carl Jung often described archetypes as forces that shape the human mind from deep within the unconscious. When these forces aren't held in balance, they spill into society as extremes. That's exactly what we see in today's cultural fragmentation. The archetype of the divide is alive and well, pulling people toward polar opposites. One side clings to moral superiority, the other to reactionary defiance, and both mistake their projection for truth. The shadow isn't integrated. It's thrown across the battlefield, fueling mass hysteria. What we call politics is often just the unconscious made visible, clashing in archetypal possession. This is why the West feels like it's in an identity crisis. People believe the fight is about left versus right, justice versus oppression, or freedom versus control. But beneath those narratives lies something older, the psyche splitting because it cannot bear tension. Jung called this psychological splitting, where conscience collapses under the pressure of opposites. Instead of cultivating inner dialogue, individuals turn to tribalism, convinced their ideology is salvation. Yet, when archetypes dominate unchecked, philosophy turns into dogma, and wisdom turns into warfare. The inner life is forgotten, sacrificed on the altar of cultural polarization. We can see this archetypal drama unfold in everyday life. Family dinners erupt into debates that sound like rehearsed scripts from social media. Friendships fracture over projections that have nothing to do with personal experience, but everything to do with collective complexes. It's as though the persona itself is reshaped by tribal expectations, forcing people into psychological masks they never chose. The result? Repression of authentic voices, ego inflation disguised as righteousness, and the slow erosion of real human connection. What should be a meeting of minds becomes a war of identities. Think of it in terms of art. A painting without contrast has no depth. It's flat. But in culture, instead of holding contrast, we erase it. Shadow projection becomes the paintbrush, dividing canvases into black and white with no shades in between. This is why cultural fragmentation feels so exhausting. It strips life of nuance. Archetypes demand integration, not elimination. When we demonize the other side, we're really externalizing an unconscious conflict within ourselves. And Jung would argue that until we confront the collective shadow, the cycle of repression and projection will only intensify. So the archetype of the divide keeps manifesting, and the collective unconscious keeps bleeding into headlines. Every cultural war is less about policy and more about psyche. And here's the kicker: until individuation becomes the priority, society will continue to fracture under archetypal possession. The divide we see is just a mirror of the inner divide each person avoids. And what happens when no one holds the mirror? The unconscious grows louder, pushing us toward crises that force us to face what we've been denying all along. Individuation as the antidote to ideological possession. Carl Jung believed individuation was the great task of life, the process of becoming whole by integrating shadow, persona, ego, and self into a unified dialogue. In a time when cultural polarization drives people into collective hysteria, this path becomes not just personal, but essential for the West's survival. The woke mind virus isn't defeated by louder shouting or moral superiority. It dissolves only when individuals step back from tribalism and dare to face their own unconscious conflict. That means confronting the shadow instead of projecting it, and balancing archetypes instead of being possessed by them. To individuate is to resist ideological possession. It's to see that moral superiority and cancel culture are shortcuts that avoid the harder work of self-examination. True awakening is not parroting slogans, but engaging in inner dialogue with one's conscience, asking, where am I inflating my ego? Where am I repressing my fears? This is practical philosophy in action. It transforms the art of living from performance into authenticity. And authenticity always begins where repression ends, when we admit our shadow is part of us, not an enemy to be exiled. This isn't abstract psychology. It's something you can practice. Instead of scrolling endlessly through culture wars, pick up Jung's memories, dreams, reflections, or even Marcus Aurelius's meditations. Both works model what it means to hold tension without collapsing into extremes. Or Try journaling. Each night, write down one projection you caught yourself making that day. Maybe you judge someone for being arrogant. Ask yourself, where does arrogance live in me? These small acts begin the individuation process, pulling energy away from cultural fragmentation and back into personal wholeness. Jung understood that individuation requires courage. It's far easier to dissolve into identity politics than to face the terrifying freedom of the self. The collective shadow feels safer because it distributes blame outward. But individuation demands taking radical responsibility. It asks each person to see their archetypes not as masks, but as mirrors. The lover, the warrior, the trickster, all live inside the human mind, waiting to be integrated. Only by embracing them can we dissolve the unconscious conflicts fueling cancel culture and repression. Healing society begins with healing the inner life. So the antidote is not louder voices, but deeper ones. Not more tribalism, but more wisdom. Individuation is the only path that can turn fragmentation into integration. It doesn't silence the shadow, it transforms it. And this process, though deeply personal, radiates outward. A culture made of individuals committed to self-awareness cannot be possessed by ideological extremes. It begins one person at a time, confronting the collective shadow within, and slowly, the West remembers that unity is not uniformity, but the integration of opposites. Here's the hard truth. The battles tearing the West apart aren't really out there. They're happening inside each of us. Every time we demonize others, repress our own flaws, or hide behind tribal masks, we feed the very shadow Jung warned us about. But imagine what would happen if, instead of collapsing into identity politics or cancel culture, you chose individuation. If you confronted your unconscious conflict and reclaimed your inner dialogue. That shift doesn't just change your psyche, it changes the collective. So I'll ask you, how much of your life has been dictated by projection instead of wisdom? How often do you silence yourself out of fear of cultural polarization, rather than speak with authentic conscience? These questions aren't meant to accuse you. They're meant to wake you up. Because individuation isn't reserved for scholars of philosophy or psychoanalysis. It's a practical art of living, available to anyone brave enough to stop repressing and start integrating. And that includes you, right here, right now. If this stirred something in you, if you felt the sting of recognition, it's time to act. Don't just absorb these ideas, apply them. Journal your shadow. Question your tribalism. Read Carl Jung and wrestle with the archetypes of your own mind. And most importantly, don't walk away from this channel without committing to your growth. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and stay in the conversation. Because the West doesn't heal through louder convictions, it heals through wiser individuals. The next step begins with you.